When everyone at the Willow Creek land auction saw Emily Thornton walk in with dirt-stained work boots and faded overalls, they assumed she was lost or cleaning staff, never guessing she'd outbid 7 millionaire developers for the contested 300-acre parcel that bordered Riverstone Estates. But as Emily stood trembling at the auction podium, bank loan papers clutched in her calloused hands while signing for the $2.7 million purchase that had shocked the room into silence, she had no idea that beneath the soil she'd just mortgaged, her future to protect, lay the unmarked grave of Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker, her grandfather's commanding officer who had saved his life at Normandy 80 years earlier, whose dying wish to be buried in his hometown meadow had been secretly honored, and whose sacrifice would have been erased forever by luxury condominiums without Emily's desperate intervention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the rolling fields of Willow Creek, the kind of heat that seemed to press the very air from your lungs and shimmer like a mirage above the parched earth. The drought had stretched into its third month, turning what should have been vibrant green pastures into expanses of brittle yellow stalks that crackled underfoot. Emily Thornton wiped sweat from her brow with a forearm already streaked with dirt, leaving another smudge across her tanned face. At 32, Emily carried herself with the weathered resilience of someone who had learned to find hope in even the most unforgiving seasons. Her hands, calloused from years of working the stubborn soil of Thornton family farm, moved methodically. As she examined the irrigation equipment that had once again failed under the strain of constant use, the old Ford pickup truck that had belonged to her father sat nearby, its blue paint faded to a pale ghost of its former color, the bed loaded with repair parts that had cost nearly the last of this month's emergency fund. Emily stared at the cracked irrigation pipe, calculating whether she had enough materials to extend the repair to the western field before tomorrow's scorching temperatures could do further damage to their struggling corn crop. The "For Sale" sign at the edge of the property cast a long shadow despite its small size, a constant reminder of how precariously close they were to losing everything. After her father's stroke last year, the medical bills had piled up faster than the harvest could cover them. 3 generations of Thorntons had worked this land, but Emily feared she might be the last. Jake Morales approached from the direction of the main house, his 17-year-old frame awkward with recent growth, but his movement showing the natural efficiency of someone who understood the value of conservation of energy, of resources, of time. He had been working for Emily for the past 2 summers, learning the rhythms of farm life with a quiet determination that reminded Emily of herself at that age. "The Weather Service just issued another heat advisory," Jake said, handing Emily a bottle of water from the cooler he carried. "They're saying it could hit 103 degrees tomorrow." Emily drank deeply, the lukewarm water still a blessing against her parched throat. She glanced toward the eastern boundary where their property met the contested land parcel that had been the talk of the county for months. 300 acres of prime river-adjacent property that had belonged to Old Man Whitaker until his death last winter. With no living relatives, the land had gone into probate and was finally being auctioned off tomorrow. "Have you heard anything new about the auction?" Jake asked, following her gaze to the neighboring property. "Just that Riverstone Development has sent 3 representatives to town," Emily replied, returning her attention to the broken pipe. "Word is they're prepared to go as high as $3 million to secure the parcel for their luxury condominium project." Jake whistled low. That kind of money in Willow Creek. Might as well be talking about building a rocket to the moon. Emily nodded, her expression grim. The development would forever change the character of their small farming community, but more immediately concerning were the water rights. Whoever purchased the Whitaker property would control access to the creek that had sustained the surrounding farms for generations. If Riverstone got their hands on it, there was no guarantee the agricultural water access would continue, not when there was more profit in redirecting it to swimming pools and decorative fountains for wealthy condo owners. You should head home, Emily told Jake, noting how the shadows had lengthened across the field. Your grandmother will be wondering where you are, and we've got an early start tomorrow. Jake hesitated, looking at the partially repaired irrigation system. What about finishing this section? The corn won't make it another day without water. I'll handle it, Emily said. Go on, I'll see you at first light. As Jake's footsteps receded across the dusty field, Emily returned to her work, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of problem-solving that farm life demanded. Her phone rang just as she was tightening the final coupling on the repaired pipe section. Thornton. Farm, she answered, cradling the phone against her shoulder while her hands continued working. Emily, it's Sophia Martinez from First National Bank. Emily's hands stilled on the pipe fitting. Sophia had been her father's friend for decades and had worked harder than anyone to help the Thorntons keep their farm after his stroke. But her calls rarely brought good news these days. What can I do for you, Sophia? I've been reviewing your application for the operating loan extension, Sophia said, her voice carefully professional, but with an undercurrent of genuine concern. The committee met this afternoon. Emily closed her eyes briefly, bracing herself. Without the extension, they wouldn't make it to harvest. And she prompted when Sophia didn't immediately continue. It's been approved, but not for the full amount you requested. They've authorized $50,000 instead of the $75,000 you applied for. Relief and concern battled for dominance in Emily's mind. $50,000 would keep them operational through the summer, but with such a narrow margin that any additional problems, equipment failure, weather damage, another medical emergency could still sink them. That's workable, Emily said finally. Thank you, Sophia. I know you went to bat for us. There's something else, Sophia continued, her tone shifting slightly. I heard from Caroline at the county clerk's office that you requested the property assessment and title history for the Whitaker land. Emily, please tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. Emily glanced again toward the neighboring property where the evening sun cast long shadows across the meadow that had always been her favorite view from the farm. I'm just doing my due diligence, she replied carefully. That land controls our water access. I need to understand exactly what we're facing when Riverstone takes ownership. Sophia was quiet for a moment. The opening bid is set at $1.5 million, Emily. The developers from Riverstone have been securing local financing all week. They're prepared to go much higher if necessary. I understand that, do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're contemplating something impossible. Even with every asset your family owns as collateral, there's no financial institution in the county that would back you for that kind of purchase. Emily thought about the documents she discovered in her grandfather's old Army footlocker 3 days ago, the letters, the maps, the final request from a dying officer to the young soldier who had carried him from the battlefield. She thought about the promise her grandfather had made, and the one her father had kept, until his stroke had left him unable to continue the decades-long vigil over the neighboring property. Some things are worth fighting for even when you can't win, Emily said quietly. My grandfather taught me that. After hanging up, Emily stood in her field for a moment, watching as the irrigation system finally pumped life-giving water to the struggling corn crop. The farm had been her family's anchor for 3 generations, the place where her grandfather had returned after World War II to build a life worthy of the sacrifices he had witnessed, the land her father had expanded through decades of careful stewardship. Now it all hung by the thinnest of threads, vulnerable to forces that cared nothing for history or heritage. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father's caregiver. Good day today. He asked about the eastern field 3 times. I think he knows something's happening. Emily smiled faintly at the message. Her father's mind drifted in and out of clarity. Since the stroke, but his connection to the land remained undiminished. He would know immediately if the Whitaker property fell into developers' hands, would feel the loss as keenly as if it were a physical wound. The documents she'd found had explained why. The eastern meadow wasn't just neighboring land, it was sacred ground, a promise kept through silent decades of guardianship. Tomorrow, that promise would be tested against the inexorable force of progress and profit. Emily finished securing the irrigation system and climbed into her father's old pickup, the engine protesting briefly before settling into a familiar rumble. As she drove slowly back toward the farmhouse, her mind worked through calculations and contingencies, searching for leverage in a situation that seemed to offer none. The farmhouse came into view, its white clapboard siding glowing amber in the mild setting sun. Built in 1946 when her grandfather returned from the war, it had been expanded over the years, but still retained the solid, unpretentious character of a home built by a man who understood the value of sturdy foundations. Sarah Chen, her father's caregiver, met her on the porch. At 58, Sarah brought the same careful attention to her nursing duties that she had once applied as the county's most respected midwife before retirement. "He's having one of his clearer days," Sarah said softly. "He ate well at dinner and has been looking through old photographs. He asked specifically about the auction tomorrow." Emily nodded, removing her work boots before entering the house. "Did you tell him anything?" "Only that you were handling it," Sarah replied. He seemed satisfied with that. "He trusts you, Emily, more than you sometimes realize." Inside, the house was cool and quiet, the ancient air conditioning system laboring valiantly against the summer heat. Emily found her father in his study, wheelchair positioned by the window that overlooked the eastern fields and the Whitaker property beyond. Robert Thornton had once been a physically imposing man, his frame hardened by decades of agricultural work and his presence commanding, enough that the bank had never questioned his loan applications. The stroke had diminished his body, but not the essential dignity that defined him. At 72, his hair was completely silver, his face lined with the kind of weathering that came from a lifetime under open skies. "There's my girl," he said. As Emily entered, his speech slightly slurred but comprehensible. "Come look at what I found." Emily crossed to her father's side, bending to examine the photograph he held with hands that trembled slightly. The black and white image showed two young soldiers in World War II uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before what appeared to be a French farmhouse. One was clearly her grandfather as a young man. The other, taller and with officer's insignia, was unfamiliar. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker and Private First Class Samuel Thornton, her father said, tapping the image with a finger. "Normandy, 1944. A week before the colonel saved Dad's life at St. Lo." Emily had heard fragments of the story throughout her childhood, how her grandfather had been pinned down by enemy fire, how his commanding officer had led a desperate rescue mission, how Samuel had been the only survivor of his squad, thanks to Colonel Whitaker's actions. But the connection to their neighbor, Old Man Whitaker, who had died last winter, had never been explicitly stated. "Dad," Emily said carefully, "was our neighbor related to this man? To Lieutenant Colonel Whitaker?" Robert Thornton's eyes, still sharp despite his physical limitations, met his daughter's. "Not related, the same man. James Whitaker came home from the war and bought that land in 1947. Lived there alone until the day he died." Emily felt a chill despite the summer heat. But that would make him over 100 years old when he died. 103, her father confirmed. "Tough old soldier to the end. Why didn't you ever tell me? All these years living next to him, and you never mentioned that he served with Grandpa?" Robert's gaze drifted back to the photograph, his expression distant. "Some promises don't need explaining, just keeping. Your grandfather made a vow to Colonel Whitaker during the grandfather made a vow to Colonel Whitaker. War. I honored that vow after Dad died. Now it falls to you." Emily felt the weight of unspoken history pressing down upon her. What promise, Dad? What vow are we talking about? Instead of answering directly, Robert pointed to the old army footlocker in the corner of his study. "Third folder from the top. In the right-hand side. Read it for yourself. Then you'll understand what's at stake tomorrow." Emily crossed to the footlocker, finding the folder exactly where her father had indicated. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers, handwritten letters, military documents, and a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be the eastern meadow of the Whitaker property. But it was the final letter, dated June 1944, and written in a shaky hand, that caught her attention. "Samuel, if you're reading this, then you made it home and I did not. I've no family left in this world, no one to carry on the Whitaker name. My final wish is simple. I want to rest in the meadow behind my family's old farm in Willow Creek, where I spent my boyhood summers. Not in some military cemetery surrounded by strangers, but in the one place where I knew true peace. If you survive this hell, find that meadow. Make sure it remains undisturbed. This is the last request of a dying man to the soldier he was proud to serve alongside. Lt. Col. James Whitaker." Emily looked up from the letter, her mind racing to connect the pieces. "Dad, are you saying that Colonel Whitaker is buried on his property? That Grandpa brought him home and buried him there after the war?" Robert nodded slowly. "In the eastern meadow beneath the old oak. No marker, no record, just as the Colonel requested. When James Whitaker appeared in Willow Creek after the war, buying that very property, your grandfather was shocked beyond words. It wasn't the Colonel who had died, but another officer. The letters got mixed up in the chaos. But by then, Dad had already fulfilled what he thought was the Colonel's dying wish. So Grandpa told him what he'd done, eventually. And do you know what Whitaker said? He said the truest part of a man is what he wishes for when he believes his time has ended. He asked Dad to make the same promise again, that when the real James Whitaker died, he would be laid to rest in that same meadow, beside the officer who had been mistakenly buried there. Both of them returned to the soil they had fought to protect. Emily sat heavily in the chair opposite her father, the implications crashing over her. And now Riverstone wants to build luxury condominiums on top of what is essentially a private cemetery. Not just any graves, Robert said, his voice strengthening with emotion. The resting place of men who gave everything for their country, who came home carrying burdens we can never fully understand. Your grandfather kept his promise. I kept mine. Tomorrow that pledge faces its greatest test. Emily looked down at the faded letter in her hands, feeling the weight of 3 generations of commitment. The auction's set for 10 tomorrow morning. Riverstone has millions to spend. We barely have enough to keep the farm running. Robert Thornton reached across and took his daughter's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. When Colonel Whitaker saved your grandfather at St. Lay, he didn't do it because victory was certain. He did it because some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds tell you to surrender. He paused, his eyes finding hers with complete clarity. The question isn't whether you can win, Emily. It's whether you can live with yourself if you don't try. As darkness fell over Thornton Farm, Emily sat on the porch swing that had hung in the same spot since her grandfather built the house. The night was clear, stars piercing the black canopy above with ancient light that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach this small corner of the world. Her laptop was open beside her, spreadsheets displaying numbers that refused to add up to anything but impossibility. Even leveraging every asset the family owned, the farm, the equipment, her father's modest retirement account, she couldn't come close to the opening bid for the Whitaker property. And yet, the alternative was unthinkable. Concrete foundations, poured over the graves of men who had sacrificed everything. The sacred trust of 3 generations, broken on her watch. Her phone rang, the screen showing Jake's grandmother's number. Carmen Morales had been the town's librarian for 40 years before retirement and remained the community's unofficial historian. "Ms. Morales," Emily answered. "Is everything all right?" "Better than all right, perhaps," Carmen replied, her voice carrying the slight accent that 70 years in America had never completely erased. "Jake told me about your interest in the Whitaker auction. I've been researching something that might help you." Emily sat up straighter, hope flickering faintly. "I'm listening." The Whitaker property was designated as potentially historic farmland in a 1967 county survey. Carmen explained. The designation was never formalized because Old Man Whitaker refused to allow the Historical Society access for proper documentation. But the preliminary paperwork exists in the county archives. "I found it this evening. How does that help us?" Emily asked, struggling to see the relevance. "Historic designation can significantly complicate development plans," Carmen continued. "It wouldn't stop the auction, but it would require any new owner to preserve certain aspects of the property. Not very appealing for developers wanting to build condominiums. It wasn't a solution, but it was the first potential obstacle to Riverstone's plans that Emily had encountered. "Could we get the designation formalized before the auction?" "Impossible," Carmen admitted. "That process takes months. But even the possibility of designation might give some bidders pause. Or at least give you leverage to negotiate for the eastern meadow if you can't secure the entire property." After thanking Carmen and ending the call, Emily returned to her spreadsheets with renewed determination. If she couldn't outbid Riverstone for the entire property, perhaps there was still a way to protect the sacred ground that had been entrusted to her family's care. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia at the bank. "Whatever you're planning for tomorrow, remember that some battles can't be won with money alone. Your grandfather understood that better than anyone." The message sparked a memory, her grandfather telling stories on this very porch about the war, about coming home, about rebuilding a life worthy of those who hadn't returned. One phrase he repeated often: "The most valuable currency isn't the dollar, Emmy. It's the willingness to stand up when everyone else stays seated." Emily looked out toward the eastern boundary of their property, where the Whitaker land lay silent under starlight. Somewhere beneath that soil rested men who had understood the true cost of freedom, who had carried that knowledge home and built quiet lives in its shadow. Their story deserved to be remembered, not paved over for profit. Tomorrow she would stand up. Whether she could win or not remained to be seen, but the attempt itself was a kind of victory, a declaration that some things remained beyond price, beyond development, beyond the relentless march of progress that too often erased the past in its rush toward the future. Emily closed her laptop and went inside to prepare for the battle ahead. Carrying the weight of 3 generations' promises and the determination to honor them, whatever the cost, the Willow Creek Municipal Building dated from 1935. A solid brick structure built during the New Deal era that had housed town government. Through economic booms and busts, through war and peace, through the slow transformation of a farming community into a place increasingly shaped by outside interests and capital, Emily arrived 40 minutes early for the auction. Dressed in the only business attire she owned, a navy pantsuit purchased 3 years ago for an agricultural conference in Des Moines that still smelled faintly of the cedar closet where it was stored. She had spent the morning at First National Bank with Sophia, signing papers that put everything her family owned at risk. The loan approval had come through at the last possible moment, a testament to Sophia's influence with the loan committee, and to the Thornton family's decades of reliable history with the bank. It wasn't enough to compete with Riverstone's resources, but it was enough to enter the bidding, enough to ensure that someone would stand for the history and sanctity of the land. Before it changed hands forever, Jake waited for her outside the municipal building, uncharacteristically dressed in a button-down shirt and tie. "Gran asked me to give you this," he said, handing Emily a manila folder. "It's all the historical documentation she could compile overnight. She said it might not stop them, but it could slow them down. "Thank you," Emily said, tucking the folder into her leather portfolio alongside the loan documents. "How's your grandmother feeling about all this?" "Fired up," Jake replied with a small smile. "She said to tell you that your grandfather would be proud." "Whatever that means." Emily nodded, throat suddenly tight with emotion. "It means a lot, more than I can explain right now." Inside, the town council chamber had been rearranged for the auction. Rows of chairs faced a small podium where the auctioneer would stand. At the front of the room, a large map of the Whitaker property was displayed, showing its proximity to Thornton Farm and the creek that served as the water lifeline for the surrounding agricultural land. Emily took a seat in the back row, watching as the room gradually filled with people. Most were locals, curious to witness what would likely be the largest land transaction in county history. But interspersed among them were individuals whose crisp suits and attentive manner marked them as representatives of development companies and investment groups. 3 men in particular drew Emily's attention, clustered near the front, engaged in low conversation, occasionally consulting tablets and smartphones. The Riverstone delegation, undoubtedly, prepared to secure the property that would transform their luxury condominium concept from rendering to reality. Mayor Helen Okafor entered from a side door, followed by the county clerk and Martin Whitfield, the probate attorney who would be conducting the auction. The mayor spotted Emily and made her way over, her expression a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "Emily," she said quietly, taking the seat beside her. "I wasn't sure you'd come. This can't be easy to watch." "I'm not here to watch, Helen," Emily replied, patting the portfolio containing her loan documents. "I'm here to bid." The mayor's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You can't be serious." "Riverstone is prepared to go to $3 million if necessary. Everyone knows that Thornton Farm has been struggling since Robert's stroke. Some things are worth fighting for even when you can't win," Emily sighed, echoing the words that had become a kind of mantra over the past 24 hours. Helen studied Emily's face, searching for signs of a practical joke or delusion. Finding neither, she sighed heavily. "You know, I've always supported local agriculture. Emily, your family has been the backbone of this community for generations. But this—" She gestured toward the front of the room, where the Riverstone representatives were now arranging themselves in a confident formation. "This is a different league altogether. These people buy and sell properties worth 10 times this parcel before breakfast." "I understand what I'm up against," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "But I have to try." Before Helen could respond, Martin Whitfield approached the podium, tapping the microphone to signal the start of proceedings. The gentle murmur of conversation died away as everyone took their seats. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Martin began, his practiced auctioneer's voice filling the chamber. "We're gathered today for the public auction of the property formerly owned by James Whitaker, deceased. The parcel consists of approximately 300 acres of mixed-use land including meadow, woodland, and approximately half a mile of creek frontage. The property is being sold as is, with all existing easements and water rights transferred to the new owner." Emily listened as Martin detailed the technical aspects of the auction, the incremental bidding process, the requirement for financial pre-qualification, the non-refundable deposit required from the winning bidder. Her hands tightened around her portfolio as he announced the opening bid. "We'll start the bidding at $1,500,000. Do I have an opening bid?" One of the Riverstone representatives raised his hand immediately. $1,500,000. Martin nodded. "I have $1,500,000. Do I hear $1,600,000? A woman in a charcoal suit near the middle of the room raised her hand. $1,600,000. $1,700,000, countered Riverstone without hesitation. Emily watched as the bidding quickly escalated, moving in $100,000 increments with a speed that made her heart sink. Within minutes, the price had reached $2,200,000, with Riverstone and two other professional bidders trading increases as casually as if they were discussing the weather. At $2,500,000, one of the competing bidders shook his head slightly and closed the tablet in front of him. The remaining competitor, the woman in the charcoal suit, continued for two more rounds before also withdrawing from the bidding at $2,700,000. "I have $2,700,000 from Riverstone Development," Martin announced, scanning the room. "Going once. Cohen." Emily's hand trembled as she raised it. $2,800,000. A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the room. Helen beside her let out an audible gasp. The Riverstone representatives turned in their seats, expressions shifting from confusion to irritation. As they identified the source of the competing bid, Martin seemed equally surprised but recovered quickly. "I have $2,800,000 from Miss Thornton. Do I hear $2,900,000? The lead Riverstone representative nodded curtly. $2,900,000. Emily swallowed hard, mentally reviewing the maximum amount the bank had authorized, $3 million. The room fell completely silent. Even those who had come merely to observe seemed to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. A local farmer somehow competing with corporate developers in a financial arena where she should have been hopelessly outmatched. Riverstone team huddled briefly, conferring in urgent whispers. After a moment, their leader turned back to the auctioneer. $3,100,000. Emily closed her eyes briefly. She had reached the absolute limit of what the bank would finance, even with every asset her family owned as collateral. One more bid would push her beyond what she could possibly fulfill. $3,200,000, she said, her voice remarkably steady for someone who had just committed to financial impossibility. The Riverstone representative's face flushed with annoyance. He leaned toward his colleagues again, their discussion becoming more animated. Finally, he turned back to the auctioneer. $3,300,000. Martin looked to Emily, his expression professional, but his eyes conveying sympathy. "I have $3,300,000. From Riverstone. Do I hear $3,400,000? Emily sat frozen, the reality of defeat washing over her. She had gone beyond her authorized limit, had risked everything her family owned, and still fallen short. The sacred trust her grandfather and father had maintained for decades would end today, broken not by lack of commitment, but by the simple arithmetic of wealth. "Miss Thornton," Martin prompted gently. Emily began, but her response was interrupted by the back door of the chamber, swinging open. An elderly man in a wheelchair entered, pushed by a nurse in scrubs. Robert Thornton had not left the farm since his stroke, had not appeared in public or participated in community affairs. Yet here he was, his face pale but determined, his eyes clear and focused on the proceedings at the front of the room. A collective murmur rose from the assembled crowd. Many present had known Robert for decades, had done business with him, had respected his quiet integrity and his commitment to the land. His presence transformed the auction from a simple business transaction to something with deeper community significance. Sarah Chun wheeled Robert down the center aisle to where Emily sat, stunned by her father's unexpected appearance. "Dad," she whispered, "you shouldn't be here." The doctor said, "Some moments require witnessing," Robert interrupted, his speech slightly slurred but intelligible. "Some battles must be fought face to face." Martin cleared his throat at the podium. "We have a bid of $3,300,000 from Riverstone Development. Do I hear $3,400,000? Emily looked at her father, reading in his eyes both understanding of the impossible position and unwavering support for her decision, whatever it might be. She had gone beyond what the bank had authorized, had already risked financial ruin for her family. One more bid would be pure bluff, a gesture without backing. 3,400,000, she said, the words leaving her mouth before she had fully processed the consequences. The Riverstone representative's face darkened with visible anger. He conferred with his colleagues, their gestures becoming increasingly frustrated. After what seemed an eternity, he turned back to the auctioneer. 3,500,000. Martin looked again to Emily, his expression now conveying not just sympathy but concern. I have 3,500,000 from Riverstone. Do I hear 3,600,000? The room was utterly silent. Emily felt the weight of every gaze, the unspoken question of how a struggling farmer could possibly be competing at this financial level. She had reached the end of her resources, had already committed to more than she could possibly fulfill. One more bid would be nothing but desperation. Before I continue, she said, rising slowly from her seat, I'd like to present some information relevant to this auction. Martin hesitated, glancing toward the county attorney who sat at a side table. After receiving a subtle nod, he gestured for Emily to proceed. Emily walked to the front of the room, her father's wheelchair squeaking slightly as Sarah pushed him behind her. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the silent chamber, each step carrying her closer to what felt like both certain defeat and necessary truth. Reaching the podium, she opened the folder Carmen Morales had provided, spreading the documents so they were visible to those in the front row, including the Riverstone representatives. These are county records from 1967, she began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. They document the Whitaker property's eligibility for historic designation due to its connection to pre-industrial agricultural practices and its status as one of the oldest intact farm parcels in the county. The lead Riverstone representative leaned forward, examining the documents with narrowed eyes. This designation was never formalized, he objected. It has no legal standing. Not yet, Emily acknowledged. But the documentation exists and provides grounds for expedited review by the State Historical Commission. At minimum, such a review would delay any development plans by 6 to 8 months. Murmurs spread through the room as the implications became clear. For a development company, time was money. Delays meant carrying costs, extended financing, and postponed return on investment. Furthermore, Emily continued, withdrawing a second set of documents from her portfolio, I have evidence that the eastern meadow portion of the property, approximately 40 acres, contains what may qualify as a private cemetery. This announcement caused a more dramatic reaction. The county attorney sat up straighter, and the mayor's eyebrows rose in surprise. A cemetery? Martin repeated. There's no record of any burial ground on the Whitaker property. Not in public records, Emily agreed. But I have documentation indicating that at least 2 World War II veterans are interred in unmarked graves in the eastern meadow. Under state law, disturbing such graves without proper investigation and potential relocation would constitute a criminal offense. She placed the letters from her grandfather's footlocker on the podium, along with the hand-drawn map showing the location in the eastern meadow. My grandfather, Samuel Thornton, was a witness to these burials. My father, Robert Thornton, has maintained the site for decades in accordance with promises made to the deceased. The Riverstone representatives huddled in urgent consultation, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. After a moment, their leader stood. May we examine these documents? He asked, his tone significantly less confident than before. Martin looked to Emily, who nodded. The Riverstone team approached the podium, studying the letters and map with growing consternation. The lead representative took several photos with his smartphone, presumably sending them to legal advisors. After several tense minutes, the Riverstone team returned to their seats. Their leader leaned toward his colleagues for one final consultation before addressing the auctioneer. In light of this new information, Riverstone Development withdraws its most recent bid and will not be submitting any further offers at this time. A wave of astonished murmurs swept through the room. Martin appeared momentarily flustered by this unexpected development. Well then, he stammered. The current high bid stands at $3,400,000 from Miss Thornton. Going once, going twice. Sold to Emily Thornton for $3,400,000. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the chamber, sealing a transaction that seemed impossible just minutes earlier. Emily stood frozen at the podium, the magnitude of what had just occurred washing over her in waves of disbelief, elation, and terror. She had just committed to paying more than twice what the bank had authorized. The Thornton farm, already struggling under existing debt, could not possibly generate the additional funding required. She had won the auction but created a financial impossibility that would likely cost her family everything they had spent generations building. As the reality of her situation settled in, Emily felt a hand on her arm. Her father had wheeled himself to the podium, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did it," he said softly. "You kept our promise." Before Emily could respond, Martin approached with paperwork for the initial deposit and contract signing. "Miss Thornton, I'll need 10% down immediately, with the balance due within 30 days. That's $340,000 today." Emily's momentary triumph evaporated. She had won the auction but had no practical way to fulfill the financial obligations she had just created. The bank had extended financing to the absolute limit of what the Thornton assets could secure, and she had bid well beyond that amount. She began, struggling to find words that could possibly address the impossibility of her situation. "Excuse me," a voice called from the back of the room. "I believe I can help with that." All heads turned to see an elderly man in meticulously pressed uniform making his way slowly down the center aisle, leaning heavily on a cane. The collection of medals and ribbons on his chest identified him as a military veteran of significant rank and service. Despite his age, easily in his 90s, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Emily didn't recognize him, but the reaction of others in the room suggested many did. The mayor stood respectfully, and several older community members nodded in evident deference. "General Richards," Martin said, surprise evident in his voice. "This is unexpected." General Richards made his way to the front of the room, his progress slow but deliberate. When he reached the podium, he extended a weathered hand to Emily. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of decades of authority. "I've been following this auction with great interest. My name is General William Richards, United States Army, retired. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance in Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker." Emily shook his hand, confusion evident in her expression. "You knew Colonel Whitaker?" "We served together during the Korean War," General Richards replied. "He saved my life at Heartbreak Ridge in 1951, much as he saved your grandfather at St. Louis. James Whitaker had a habit of being in the right place at the wrong time, you might say." The general turned to address the room at large, his voice strengthening as he spoke. "I've been aware of this auction for some time. When I learned the Whitaker property was being sold, I had my foundation investigate the potential buyers. Riverstones. Plans would have destroyed not just the resting place of two brave soldiers, but a piece of living history that connects our community to the sacrifices of previous generations." He turned back to Emily, his expression softening. "Your grandfather and father maintained a sacred trust for decades without recognition or reward. That kind of commitment deserves support, not financial ruin." From his jacket pocket, the general withdrew a folded document and handed it to Martin. "This is a certified bank draft for $340,000, the required deposit, on Ms. Thornton's winning bid. My foundation will provide the remaining balance before the 30-day deadline." Emily stared at the general in disbelief. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because some promises transcend generations. General Richards replied. Because some debts can never be fully repaid. And because the men who rest in that meadow deserve better than to have their sacrifice erased by luxury condominiums. He turned to Robert Thornton, offering a crisp salute that belied his advanced age. Your father was a good man, Mr. Thornton. He understood that the true cost of war isn't measured in dollars or territory, but in the obligation we owe to those who fought alongside us. Robert returned the salute as best he could, tears gathering in his eyes. Thank you, General. Martin cleared his throat, visibly moved but attempting to maintain professional composure. If there are no objections, I'll process this deposit and prepare the final paperwork. The Riverstone representatives who had been watching this exchange, with barely concealed frustration, gathered their materials and departed without comment. Their swift exit seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the chamber, and conversations erupted throughout the room as the significance of what had transpired began to sink in. Emily found herself surrounded by well-wishers, neighbors, community members, and even some who had come expecting to witness a corporate triumph, but had instead seen something far more meaningful. Through it all, she kept returning to the same question. How had this impossible victory occurred? As the crowd began to disperse, General Richards approached Emily and her father, his manner more relaxed now that the formal proceedings had concluded. You have questions, he said, not a query but a statement of fact. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private. There are aspects of this situation that would benefit from a fuller explanation. Emily nodded, still processing the dramatic reversal of fortune. Our farm is just outside town. We could offer you lunch. At least. The general smiled, the expression transforming his austere features into something warmer and more approachable. I'd be honored. It's been many years since I visited Thornton Farm. Your grandfather always said it was the finest example of what a man could build when he returned from war with a clear purpose. As they prepared to leave, Martin approached with the preliminary ownership documents. Congratulations, Miss Thornton, he said, handing her a folder of paperwork. The property will be officially transferred to your name once the remaining balance is paid. In the meantime, you have full access rights as the recognized buyer. Emily accepted the folder, the weight of the papers inside seeming to represent not just a land transaction, but the transfer of a legacy, a trust that had passed from her grandfather to her father and now to her. What will you do with the property? Martin asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Emily glanced at her father, then at General Richards, reading in their expressions both support for whatever decision she might make and the unspoken weight of history that would influence that choice. Protect it, she said simply. Honor it. Ensure that the promises made are kept for another generation. As they left the municipal building, Emily noticed a small gathering of protesters across the street, local environmental activists who had opposed Riverstone's development plans on ecological grounds. Their hand-painted signs proclaimed concerns about watershed protection and habitat preservation, issues that had seemed secondary to the historical significance that had driven Emily's actions but were no less valid. This unexpected alliance of interests, veterans honoring fallen comrades, families preserving agricultural heritage, environmentalists protecting natural resources, represented something powerful. The convergence of different values around a shared recognition that some places deserve protection from the relentless pressure of development and profit. Outside, the summer heat had intensified, the midday sun beating down on the town square with undiminished force. Yet Emily felt a strange lightness as she helped her father into their truck, as if some burden she had carried without fully recognizing its weight had been partially lifted. The eastern meadow would remain undisturbed. The graves of men who had sacrificed for their country would continue their quiet repose beneath native grasses and wildflowers. The creek that sustained the surrounding farms would flow unimpeded, its course unaltered by the concrete and culverts of development. Not all victories came in expected forms, Emily reflected as she started the truck's engine. Sometimes winning meant simply ensuring that something valuable wasn't lost, that the invisible threads connecting past, present, and future remained intact for another generation to honor and maintain. As they drove toward Thornton Farm with General Richards following in his car, Emily glanced at her father, noticing a calm satisfaction in his expression that had been absent for months. "You knew something like this might happen," she said, not an accusation but a realization. "You sent me into that auction expecting some kind of intervention." Robert smiled faintly. "I expected nothing specific. But I knew that the story of that meadow, of the men who rest there, and the promises made to protect them, was powerful enough that someone might hear it and respond. General Richards has been in contact with me for years, ever since James Whitaker's health began to decline. I should have told you earlier, but some burdens are easier to carry when they're shared only when necessary." Emily absorbed this information, understanding that her father had been protecting her as much as the meadow, allowing her to focus on saving the farm without the additional weight of this generational promise until circumstances made it unavoidable. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the land, with the farm, with everything?" Robert gazed out the window at the passing landscape, the familiar fields and fences that had defined their family's boundaries for 3 generations. "That will be largely up to you. The General's Foundation will help secure the eastern meadow as a protected site, but the rest of the property, how it's used, how it's integrated with our existing operation, those decisions will shape the farm's future for decades to come." As they turned onto the gravel road leading to Thornton Farm, Emily saw Jake waiting by the mailbox, his expression shifting from anxiety to relief as he recognized their vehicle. The scene struck her as symbolic somehow, the younger generation watching anxiously for news, ready to receive whatever legacy was passed to them. Whether burden or blessing. The future of Thornton Farm remained uncertain in many ways. The challenges that had threatened their operation before the auction, drought, debt, market pressures, hadn't magically disappeared. But something fundamental had shifted. A reaffirmation that some values transcended economic calculation, that some promises were worth keeping, even at great cost. And perhaps most importantly, Emily realized as they approached the farmhouse with General Richards close behind, she was no longer carrying that responsibility alone. The network of connections revealed today, from the General's Foundation to the community members who had witnessed her stand, suggested a broader support system than she had recognized. People who understood that preserving places like the Whitaker property and farms like the Thorntons served a purpose beyond simple agriculture or land conservation. These were the anchors that held communities together across generations, the tangible links to sacrifices made and promises kept. That gave meaning to concepts like heritage and legacy. In an age increasingly defined by transience and disposability, such connections remained powerful precisely because they endured. As they parked before the farmhouse, Emily saw the eastern meadow in the distance, golden in the summer sun, seemingly unchanged for decades. Beneath its peaceful surface lay both the physical remains of fallen soldiers and the invisible weight of promises that had shaped 3 generations of her family's choices. Today, against all odds, those promises remained intact. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how best to honor both the land and the legacy she had fought to preserve. But for now, it was enough to know that when the moment demanded, she had stood up, had risked everything to protect something whose value couldn't be calculated in dollars. Some victories weren't measured in profit, margins, or balance sheets, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that something precious had been preserved for those who would come after. As Emily helped her father from the truck and watched General Richards approach with the purposeful stride of a man with stories to share, she understood that today's auction had been about far more than purchasing property. It had been about redeeming a promise, not just the one her grandfather had made to Colonel Whitaker decades ago, but the deeper promise that each generation makes to those who came before and those who will follow, to remember, to honor, to preserve what matters most, even when doing so comes at great personal cost. The kitchen of Thornton Farm had witnessed countless gatherings over its 79 years, from harvest celebrations to family holidays, from war homecomings to quiet grief. Today it held a different kind of assembly. Emily and her father, General Richards, Jake and his grandmother Carmen, and Sarah Chun, all seated around the oak table that Samuel Thornton had crafted from trees felled on the property after returning from World War II. Sarah had prepared a simple lunch: sandwiches, fresh tomatoes from the garden, and iced tea sweating in glasses that caught the afternoon light streaming through windows that faced the eastern meadow. The conversation had moved from polite small talk to deeper waters as the meal progressed. "I first met James Whitaker in 1951, General Richards said, setting down his glass carefully. "I was a young lieutenant then, green as summer corn and twice as foolish. Korea was nothing like we'd expected, colder, more brutal, tactically challenging, in ways our training hadn't prepared us for." He paused, his gaze drifting to the meadow visible through the kitchen window. "Our unit was pinned down at Heartbreak Ridge, cut off from the main force with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. Colonel Whitaker organized a rescue operation, personally leading a small team through enemy territory to reach us. 7 men went out on that mission. 3 came back, including myself." Emily noticed how her father listened with unusual intensity, as if hearing echoes of stories his own father had told about a different war, a different rescue, but the same man at the center. "James never spoke about it afterward," the general continued. "Never applied for the commendations he deserved, never used it to advance his career. When I asked him why, he said something I've remembered all these years: 'The medals go to the men who don't come back, Richards. The rest of us just try to live lives worthy of their sacrifice.'" Robert nodded slowly. "That sounds like the Colonel. Dad said he was the same after Normandy, focused on the men who didn't make it home rather than his own actions." "Your father was one of the good ones," General Richards said, his tone softening with respect. "Samuel Thornton understood the true cost of war better than most. When he contacted me in 1979 about the situation here, about the promise he'd made, and the burials in the meadow, I understood immediately why he'd taken on that responsibility." Emily leaned forward, pieces of the puzzle finally connecting. "So you've known about the grave since 1979? Before I was even born?" "Known and helped maintain the secrecy when necessary," the general confirmed. "Your grandfather was concerned that as development pressured rural communities, the Whitaker property might eventually be threatened. He wanted contingency plans in place." "But why all the secrecy?" Emily asked. "Why not properly register the graves, create a recognized memorial?" General Richards exchanged glances with Robert, a silent communication passing between men of different generations, but similar experiences. The colonel was clear about his wishes, both in that letter your grandfather received during the war, and in his own instructions before his death. He didn't want a public memorial or military honors. He wanted only to rest in the same soil as the men who died under his command, without fanfare or ceremony. Carmen Morales, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "There's cultural context worth considering, too. Post-war America was complex for returning soldiers. Many wanted to leave their service behind, to build civilian identities separate from what they'd experienced overseas. The colonel's desire for an unmarked grave might have reflected that sentiment of final privacy after a life partially defined by his military role. And legally," she added, adjusting her glasses, "private burials on family land weren't uncommon in rural areas until relatively recently. The lack of documentation wouldn't have seemed unusual in the 1940s, particularly for a returning veteran establishing a homestead." Jake, who had remained silent throughout the meal, finally spoke. So what happens now? Will the graves be properly marked? Will there be some kind of memorial? Emily looked to General Richards, recognizing that his foundation's financial support might come with expectations about how the land would be managed going forward. That will be Ms. Thornton's decision, the general said, surprising her with his deference. My foundation is prepared to establish a conservation easement on the property that would permanently protect it from development. Beyond that, how the site is honored and maintained should reflect both Colonel Whitaker's wishes and the Thornton family's judgment. Emily felt the weight of this unexpected authority. She had entered the auction merely hoping to prevent development, to maintain her family's promise for another generation. Now she found herself responsible for decisions that would shape how this history was preserved and interpreted for decades to come. I think, she said slowly, gathering her thoughts, that we should respect Colonel Whitaker's desire for privacy. No public memorial, no markers that would attract attention, but perhaps some form of documentation that ensures future generations understand the significance of the site, even if that knowledge remains relatively private. Robert nodded approvingly. The colonel never wanted recognition. He wanted peace for himself and for the men who served under him. The best memorial is simply ensuring that the land remains undisturbed. That aligns with my understanding of his wishes, General Richards agreed. My foundation can help establish legal protections that would survive any future transfer of ownership, ensuring the eastern meadow remains protected regardless of what happens to the surrounding property. The conversation turned to practical matters, the conservation easement, the integration of the Whitaker property with the existing Thornton operation, the potential for sustainable agricultural practices that would honor both the land's history and its future potential. Throughout the discussion, Emily found herself studying General Richards, wondering about his motivation for such significant financial intervention. As if sensing her unspoken question, the general addressed it directly. During a lull in the conversation, "You're wondering why I was willing to commit foundation resources to this particular property," he said, his direct manner reflecting decades of military command. "Why this meadow? Why these graves? When there are countless worthy preservation projects across the country." Emily nodded, appreciating his frankness. The thought had crossed my mind. $3 million is a substantial investment. My foundation focuses on preserving sites with significance to veterans' history, General Richards explained. Particularly those that might be overlooked by larger preservation organizations because they lack official designation or public recognition. He paused, his expression suggesting there was more to the story. But in this case, there's also a personal element. James Whitaker saved my life in Korea. After the war, he refused any formal acknowledgement of his actions, refused even my attempts to repay the debt. All he would accept was a promise that I would someday help him protect something important. To him, the general reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a yellowed envelope, handling it with reverence. He gave me this letter in 1975, instructing me to open it only after his death. When I heard he had passed last winter, I honored that request. He carefully extracted a single sheet of paper from the envelope and laid it on the table where everyone could see the precise handwriting. "Well, if you're reading this, I've finally run out of time. You've spent decades trying to repay a debt that never existed. Soldiers don't save each other for recognition or reward, but because the alternative is unthinkable. However, there's one thing I would ask of you now. In Willow Creek, there's a meadow where I've arranged to be buried alongside another soldier, a man who died with my name on his lips in Normandy, believing I had already fallen. The Thornton family has guarded this site for decades, honoring a promise made in the chaos of war. When development inevitably threatens this land, as it must in time, I ask that you help ensure the meadow remains undisturbed. Not for my sake, but for the soldier who lies there, one of countless, Men who never returned to build the lives we were fortunate enough to create after our service. The debt you believe you owe me, pay forward to them. James, silence fell over the kitchen as everyone absorbed the Colonel's words. Emily felt a deepening appreciation for the interconnected web of promises that had ultimately led to today's events. Her grandfather's pledge to a man he believed to be dying, Colonel Whitaker's protection of the soldier mistakenly buried in his name, General Richard's commitment to honor his friend's final request, and her own determination to maintain her family's guardianship. The Colonel never told me the details about the other soldier, General Richard said after a moment. Only that a promise had been made and kept by your family for decades. Robert cleared his throat, his voice stronger than it had been all day. His name was Lieutenant Michael Fairchild. He was carrying dispatches that included Colonel Whitaker's name among the officers reported killed in action, information that proved incorrect but wasn't clarified until weeks later. When Lieutenant Fairchild was mortally wounded at St. Leu, he asked my father to ensure that Colonel Whitaker was laid to rest in the meadow he had often described to his men as his childhood sanctuary. Dad fulfilled that request, Robert continued. Brought Lieutenant Fairchild's remains home after the war and buried him in the eastern meadow. When the real James Whitaker appeared in Willow Creek a year later, very much alive, it created a situation that could only be resolved through mutual understanding and respect. And now they rest together, General Richards said quietly. Two soldiers linked by circumstance and confusion, united in the same peaceful ground. There's a certain poetry to it that I believe the Colonel appreciated. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation shifted to the future of both properties. General Richards outlined how his foundation could help establish the conservation easement while providing agricultural development grants that would help the Thornton farm integrate the additional acreage into a sustainable operation. The meadow itself must remain undisturbed, he emphasized. But the surrounding land could support environmentally sensitive agriculture, perhaps organic crops or restoration of native prairie, that would create a buffer zone around the protected area. Emily found herself mentally sketching possibilities: expanded crop rotation on the arable portions, conservation grazing on the grasslands, perhaps even educational programs that could share sustainable farming practices with the community, while respecting the sacred nature of the eastern meadow. We could work with the County Agricultural Extension Office, she suggested. Develop a model for how historic preservation and working farms can coexist. It might help other family operations facing similar development pressure. Jake, who had been listening intently, spoke up with unexpected confidence. My senior project for environmental science is on watershed protection through agricultural buffer zones. I could help design a plan that would protect the creek while maintaining productive farmland. Emily smiled at his enthusiasm, recognizing in his ideas the convergence of reverence for the past and hope for the future that this property now represented. The land wasn't just a burial site or a farm, it was a living connection between generations, between veterans who had served decades apart, between agricultural traditions and environmental innovation. As the conversation continued, Sarah Chun helped Robert to the living room where he could rest more comfortably. Through the doorway, Emily could see her father settle into his favorite chair, his expression more peaceful than it had been in months. The burden of the secret he had carried, the obligation to protect the meadow that had been passed from his father, had been shared and secured for another generation. Carmen, Morales gathered the lunch dishes, waving away at Emily's attempt to help. You have planning to do, she said with gentle insistence. Let an old woman feel useful by cleaning up. Left at the kitchen table with General Richards and Jake, Emily found herself drawn to more practical questions. The Foundation's support is incredibly generous, she said. But I need to understand exactly what obligations come with it. The Thornton farm has always operated independently, and while we're grateful for the assistance, I want to ensure we're not trading one form of vulnerability for another. The general nodded approvingly, as if her directness confirmed something he had suspected about her character. A fair concern. The conservation easement would restrict development on the eastern meadow permanently. That's non-negotiable. The rest of the property would be subject to sustainable agricultural practices defined in the grant agreement, but day-to-day operational decisions would remain entirely yours. He leaned forward, his manner becoming more personal. Ms. Thornton, I've spent 40 years in military service and another 20 running a foundation dedicated to preservation. I've learned to recognize the difference between people who want to appear honorable and those who simply are. Your family has maintained a promise for 3 generations without recognition or reward. My foundation isn't looking to control your operation. We're investing in your stewardship because you've already proven its value. The validation from someone with the general's experience brought unexpected emotion to Emily's throat. For years, she had struggled against market forces and financial pressures that seemed to devalue the kind of small-scale family agriculture her ancestors had practiced. Now, paradoxically, it was that very commitment to place and tradition that had attracted the support needed to continue. In that case, she said, gathering herself, I'd like to formalize our agreement as soon as possible. The sooner the conservation easement is established, the sooner we can begin developing a sustainable management plan for the entire property. The general smiled, reaching into his briefcase to produce a folder of preliminary documents. I took the liberty of having these prepared, anticipating that we might reach an understanding. My foundation's legal team can work with your representatives to finalize the details within the next few weeks. As Emily reviewed the documents, Jake excused himself to help his grandmother with the dishes, leaving her alone with General Richards for the first time. There's something else you should know, the general said once they were relatively private. Something James told me about your grandfather that might help you understand the depth of their connection. Emily set down the papers, giving him her full attention. After Normandy, when your grandfather's squad was nearly wiped out, Samuel suffered what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress. James told me that when they reconnected after the war, your grandfather was struggling nightmares, flashbacks, the inability to talk about his experiences. Common symptoms now, but poorly understood then. The general's voice softened with compassion. The promise to protect Lieutenant Fairchild's grave. Samuel something to focus on beyond his trauma, a purpose connected to his war experience, but oriented toward peace. James believed it was instrumental in your grandfather's recovery, in his ability to build a life and family after what he'd endured. Emily thought about the grandfather she had known, quiet but never withdrawn, serious but capable of profound kindness, committed to the land with an intensity that had shaped her own connection to Thornton Farm. She had never considered how his war experiences might have influenced that character, how the promise to protect the meadow might have been as healing for him as it was honorable for those who rested there. When James appeared in Willow Creek after the war, the general continued, he recognized immediately what the promise meant to Samuel. Rather than correcting the misunderstanding about his death, he chose to share the responsibility, to create a pact between them that honored Lieutenant Fairchild while providing Samuel with continued purpose. And when my father took over that responsibility? Emily asked. James told me it became something different, but equally valuable, a bridge between generations, a way for your father to connect with Samuel's experience while making the commitment his own. Each generation of your family found their own meaning in maintaining that meadow, just as you will now. Through the kitchen window, the afternoon sun illuminated the eastern meadow, the grasses swaying gently in the summer breeze. Somewhere beneath that peaceful surface lay 2 soldiers united by circumstance and honored by decades of quiet stewardship. Their presence had shaped the destiny of Thornton Farm in ways Emily was only beginning to fully comprehend. The foundation's financial support will secure the property, General Richards said, following her gaze to the meadow. But the true preservation will come from your family's continued commitment to the land and its story. Money can purchase legal protection, but only people can provide meaningful stewardship. Emily nodded, understanding both the honor and the obligation inherent in his words. We'll maintain the trust, she said simply, just as my grandfather and father did before me. The remainder of the afternoon was spent reviewing documents, discussing potential agricultural approaches for the combined properties, and beginning to sketch what would eventually become a comprehensive management plan. Jake rejoined them, contributing ideas about watershed protection and native habitat restoration that reflected both his environmental education and his practical experience working the land. As evening approached, General Richards prepared to depart. I'll have my team begin processing the remaining payment for the property immediately, he said, gathering his briefcase. The final paperwork should be ready for your signature within the week. At the front door, he paused, looking out toward the eastern meadow now gilded by the setting sun. James would be pleased, he said quietly. Not just that the meadow is protected, but that its protection has created new possibilities for Thornton Farm. He always believed that honoring the past properly meant securing a viable future. After the general's departure, Emily found herself drawn to the eastern meadow. The day's revelations had transformed her perception of this familiar landscape. What had once been simply their neighbor's property was now revealed as a sanctuary preserved through decades of quiet commitment, a resting place for men whose sacrifice had indirectly shaped her family's destiny. Jake fell into step beside her as she walked the fence lines separating the properties. Gran says I should thank you, he said, uncharacteristically hesitant, for fighting for this land when everyone thought it was impossible, for showing that some things are worth standing up for even when you can't win. Emily smiled at the echo of her father's words. I didn't win alone, she pointed out. Sometimes the most important battles reveal allies you didn't know you had. They stopped at the boundary where the fence had fallen into disrepair over the years, the symbolic division between properties that would soon be unified under Thornton's stewardship. Do you think you would have done it? Jake asked after a moment. Bid beyond what you could afford, risked everything, if you had known there wouldn't be a miracle rescue at the end. The question cut to the heart of decisions Emily had made. In the heat of the auction, choices that had seemed both impossible and necessary in the moment. Yes, she said finally. Not because I expected to succeed, but because some promises have to be kept even when keeping them comes at great cost. My grandfather and father understood that. I think you do too. Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. Beyond his 17 years. Gran says there are two kinds of value in the world, what something is worth to others, and what it's worth to you. The trick is knowing which matters more in any given moment. As they turned back toward the farmhouse, Emily noticed her father sitting on the porch, his wheelchair positioned to face the eastern meadow. In the golden evening light, she could almost imagine him as a younger man, could almost see her grandfather before him, each generation maintaining their vigil over land that contained both physical remains and intangible significance. The day had brought revelations and resources she could never have anticipated. Financial support that would secure the farm's immediate future, legal protections that would preserve the meadow's sanctity, and deeper understanding of the interconnected promises that had shaped her family's relationship to this particular piece of earth. But perhaps most valuable was the confirmation that some commitments transcended practical calculation, that some promises were worth keeping precisely because they asked more than seemed reasonable. In a world increasingly defined by transactional relationships and economic efficiency, the Thornton family's decades-long stewardship of the eastern meadow represented something increasingly rare and precious, the willingness to value obligation above opportunity, meaning above money. As Emily approached the porch, her father looked up with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a worthy succession. The burden he had carried, the responsibility passed from his father, had now been shared, secured, and transformed into something that would continue beyond his lifetime. "It's been a good day," he said simply, his gaze returning to the meadow, now deepening into shadow as the sun slipped below the horizon. "A very good day." Emily sat beside him, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above land that now belonged to their family in more ways than one. The eastern meadow would remain undisturbed, the graves of fallen soldiers would continue their peaceful repose, and Thornton Farm would adapt to changing circumstances while honoring the promises that had defined its purpose for 3 generations. Some victories weren't measured in profit margins or balance sheets, but in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that something precious had been preserved for those who would come after. As darkness settled over the landscape, Emily understood that today's auction had been about far more than purchasing property. It had been about reaffirming values that gave meaning to her family's relationship with the land and with each other. True worth of the eastern meadow couldn't be calculated in dollars. Its value lay in the promises kept, the sacrifices honored, and the continuity maintained between generations who understood that some obligations transcended practical consideration, that sometimes standing up for what matters means risking everything, even when victory seems impossible. 3 weeks after the auction, Emily stood at the edge of the eastern meadow, watching as surveyors placed small flags marking the boundaries of the conservation easement. The morning air held the first hint of autumn Christmas, though summer still dominated the landscape with golden light and the persistent drone of insects in the tall grass. The conservation team worked with quiet efficiency, their movements respectful, as if they understood the significance of the ground they traversed. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the environmental historian from General Richards Foundation, consulted a tablet as she directed the placement of each marker, occasionally referencing the hand-drawn map Emily's grandfather had created decades earlier. "We're nearly finished with the preliminary survey," Eliza said as Emily approached. At 45, the historian carried herself with the confident precision of someone accustomed to bridging the gap between academic knowledge and practical application. "The easement will encompass approximately 42 acres, including the burial site and a buffer zone that protects both the watershed and the viewshed." Emily nodded, studying the digital map on Eliza's tablet. The formal documentation process had moved with surprising speed, accelerated by General Richards' influence and the Foundation's experience with similar preservation projects. "What happens after the survey is complete?" she asked, though she had reviewed the process multiple times in the past weeks. Something about seeing the physical markers in the meadow made the abstract legal arrangement suddenly, tangibly real. "The survey data will be incorporated into the final easement document," Eliza explained patiently. "Once recorded with the county, it becomes a permanent restriction on the deed. No development, no excavation, no alteration of the landscape within the protected area, regardless of who owns the property in the future." The permanence of this protection brought Emily a profound sense of relief. The promise her grandfather and father had maintained through personal vigilance would now be secured through legal mechanisms designed to outlast individual lifetimes. The rest of the property, the areas outside the easement, will still be subject to the sustainable agriculture requirements in the grant agreement, Eliza continued, but with considerably more flexibility for active farming. "Your management plan for those sections is quite impressive, by the way." Emily smiled at the compliment. The management plan had been a collaborative effort, her agricultural experience combined with Jake's environmental research, Carmen's historical knowledge, and input from the county extension office. The resulting document outlined a vision for integrating the Whitaker property with the existing Thornton operation in ways that honored both its past and its future potential. "We're trying to balance productivity with protection," Emily said, watching a meadowlark rise from the grass and wing its way across the golden expanse. "This land has always been productive first as native prairie, than as agricultural space. Keeping it completely wild wouldn't honor its history anymore. Then paving it for condominiums would. Eliza nodded approvingly. That's the philosophy our foundation tries to promote: conservation that acknowledges human history and sustains human communities, rather than creating artificial divides between people and the landscapes they've shaped for generations. They walked along the perimeter of what would soon be officially designated as protected ground, each lost in her own thoughts about the significance of this demarcation. For Emily, each step carried echoes of her family's commitment, her grandfather returning from war with invisible wounds and a solemn promise, her father maintaining that obligation through decades of quiet stewardship, and now her own role in securing this legacy for generations beyond her lifetime. "There's something I've been wondering," Emily said as they paused near the ancient oak that marked the approximate location of the graves. "How did General Richards know about the auction in time to prepare?" "The Whitaker property went into probate last winter, but the auction was only announced 6 weeks ago." Eliza smiled, a hint of admiration in her expression. "The General has maintained a monitoring system for properties with significance to veterans for over 20 years. Any land with historical connection to military service that comes up for auction or sale is automatically flagged for review. The Whitaker property has been on his priority watch list since 1979. That's when my grandfather first contacted him," Emily realized. "Exactly. The General may be in his 90s, but his organizational systems are impressively thorough. When the auction was announced, his team was already preparing contingency plans for acquisition or conservation, depending on how events unfolded." This revelation added another layer to Emily's understanding of the interconnected promises that had ultimately protected the meadow. While her family had maintained physical vigilance over the property for decades, General Richards had been quietly establishing financial and legal safety nets designed to activate precisely when traditional protections might fail. He never planned to attend the auction himself, Eliza continued. "The foundation was prepared to bid directly, but when he learned that you were planning to participate, that the Thornton family was still actively involved in protecting the site, he decided to wait and observe. He wanted to see if the pattern of commitment would continue into the third generation." "A test," Emily said, not with resentment, but with growing comprehension. "An opportunity," Eliza corrected gently. "The General believes deeply in the concept of earned stewardship, that the right to determine a place's future belongs to those who have demonstrated commitment to its past. Your willingness to risk everything at that auction confirmed what he already suspected about your family's relationship to this land." As they continued their circuit of the meadow, Emily noticed Jake approaching from the direction of the main farm complex, his lanky frame moving with purpose across the recently harvested field that separated the properties. He carried a stack of what appeared to be architectural drawings, his expression animated with the enthusiasm he increasingly showed for the farm's future. "Ms. Montgomery," he called as he drew nearer, "I've finished the preliminary watershed protection design. The County Extension Office thinks it could qualify for additional conservation funding if we integrate it with the management plan." Eliza accepted the drawings with evident interest. "This is excellent timing. I was just explaining to Ms. Thornton how the Foundation's grants can often leverage additional public funding for projects that serve multiple conservation goals." The three of them spread Jake's drawings on the hood of Emily's truck, examining his proposal for a series of vegetated buffer strips that would protect the creek running through both properties while creating wildlife corridors connecting fragmented habitats. The system could reduce agricultural runoff by nearly 80%, Jake explained, pointing to his calculations. And these areas would double as windbreaks and pollinator habitat, which could actually improve yields in the adjacent fields. Emily studied the plans with growing appreciation for the young man's vision. What had begun as a summer job had clearly evolved into something deeper, a Genuine investment in the land's future that mirrored her own commitment, but incorporated new knowledge and perspectives. "Have you shown these to your grandmother?" she asked. Jake nodded. Gran says it reminds her of the Victory Gardens and conservation projects from after World War II, practical improvements that served both environmental and community needs. She thinks it connects nicely with the historical narrative of the property. This intersection of past and future, of preservation and innovation, seemed increasingly to define the path forward for the combined properties. The eastern meadow would remain untouched, honoring the soldiers who rested there and the promises made to protect their peace. The surrounding land would evolve through thoughtful stewardship, its productivity enhanced rather than compromised by conservation practices. As they discussed the details of Jake's proposal, Emily's phone rang. The screen showed Sophia Martinez's number from First National Bank, a call she had been expecting since submitting the updated business plan incorporating the Whitaker property. "Sophia," she answered, stepping away from the others. "Do you have news about the operating loan restructuring?" "Better than news," Sophia replied, her voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone delivering long-awaited positive information. "The loan committee met this morning. With the conservation easement in place and the foundation's grant serving as collateral, they've approved not just restructuring the existing debt, but an additional operating line to fund the expansion projects. In your business plan." Emily closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the significance of this development. For years, the Thornton farm had operated on the financial edge, each season a careful balance between necessary investment and crippling debt. The foundation's support had secured the Whitaker property, but this loan approval meant they could actually implement the integrated management plan that would make both properties economically sustainable. That's incredible news," she managed finally. "What changed their minds?" "Just a few weeks ago, they wouldn't even approve our full extension request." "Several factors," Sophia explained. "The foundation's involvement provides significant financial stability. The conservation easement actually increases the adjacent land values by guaranteeing open space in perpetuity. And frankly, your standing in the community has never been higher after that auction. The committee recognizes that you're managing not just a farm, but a community asset." After thanking Sophia and ending the call, Emily rejoined Jake and Eliza, who were still discussing the watershed protection design. She shared the news about the loan approval, watching Jake's expression shift from concern to relief as he understood the implications for the farm's future. "This means we can actually implement these plans," he said, gesturing to his drawings. "Not just the conservation elements, but the agricultural improvements too." "It means more than that," Emily replied. "It means the bank sees Thornton Farm as a viable long-term operation, not just a struggling family business one bad season away from foreclosure. For the first time in years, we're planning for growth instead of mere survival." As the morning progressed, the survey team completed their work, each flag marking a point that would soon be recorded in legal documents filed with the county. These small markers represented something profound: the translation of personal promises into institutional protections, of individual commitments into collective responsibility. Emily invited Eliza to join them for lunch at the farmhouse, where Sarah Chun had prepared a meal that would accommodate Robert's post-stroke dietary needs while still honoring the tradition of breaking bread with visitors to the farm. As they walked back across the fields, Emily found herself reflecting on how quickly circumstances had changed, from the desperate financial straits that had preceded the auction to the cautious optimism that now colored their planning for the future. At the farmhouse, they found Robert on the porch with Carmen Morales, the two of them examining old photographs spread across a small table between their chairs. Carmen had been helping document the history of both properties, collecting oral histories and archival materials that would provide context for the conservation easement. "Just in time," Robert said as they approached. Carmen's found something interesting in the County Historical Society archives. Carmen held up a faded black and white photograph that showed a younger Robert standing beside James Whitaker at what appeared to be a Memorial Day ceremony in the 1970s. Though they weren't in uniform, both men stood with military bearing, their expressions solemn as they participated in what was clearly an official observance. This was taken in 1976, Carmen explained. The bicentennial year. According to the newspaper caption, Mr. Thornton and Mr. Whitaker were representing local World War II veterans at the county's independence celebration. Emily studied the photograph, struck by the visible connection between the two men, not just their shared military experience, but something deeper, a mutual understanding that transcended ordinary neighborly relations. He never mentioned attending events like this with the Colonel, she said, glancing at her father. Robert smiled faintly. We didn't talk about it much. Just did what needed doing when the occasion called for it. James was a private man, but he understood the importance of public remembrance, especially for those who never came home to tell their own stories. As they settled around the kitchen table for lunch, the conversation flowed naturally between practical matters, the survey, the watershed project, the loan approval, and deeper reflections on the meaning of the conservation effort. Sarah served a hearty vegetable soup with fresh bread, the simple meal somehow perfectly suited to a discussion that bridged pragmatic farming concerns and philosophical questions about obligation and stewardship. The foundation is interested in documenting the full history, Eliza mentioned as they ate. Not just the military aspects, but the agricultural legacy as well. The continuity of purpose across 3 generations of your family makes this project particularly significant from a historical perspective. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Dad always said that coming home from war gave him a different relationship with the land. Before, it was just soil and crops, the practical business of farming. After, it became something more profound. A place of healing, of rebuilding, of creating something life-affirming after seeing so much destruction. That's consistent with what we've documented among other returning veterans who chose agricultural vocations, Eliza confirmed. Particularly from World War II, but across all conflicts. There's something about cultivating growth after witnessing such tremendous loss that provided meaningful transition back to civilian life. Emily thought about her grandfather, whom she had known only as an aging farmer with calloused hands and quiet dignity. She had never fully considered how his war experiences might have shaped his approach to the land, how the promise to protect the meadow might have been part of his own healing process. Is that why maintaining the eastern meadow was so important? She asked her father, not just because of the promise itself, but because of what keeping that promise meant to Grandpa. Robert considered the question carefully. I think the promise gave him a tangible connection to what he'd experienced, a way to honor it without being consumed by it. Many men came back and never spoke of the war, just locked it away inside themselves. The meadow gave Dad a place to remember without having to explain or justify those memories to anyone else. After lunch, as Eliza prepared to depart with the survey data, she handed Emily a small package wrapped in brown paper. The general asked me to give you this, he said. You'd understand its significance. Emily unwrapped the package to find a small wooden box, similar to the one she had discovered in her grandfather's footlocker, but newer, its surface polished to a soft glow. Inside was a medallion, not a military decoration, but a custom-designed commemoration featuring an oak tree on one side and a simple inscription on the other, for promises kept across generations. Richards Foundation Stewardship Award, 2025. The General has given only 6 of these in the 20 years since establishing the foundation, Eliza explained. They recognize individuals who have demonstrated extraordinary commitment to preserving sites of significance to veterans' history, often at personal cost and without expectation of recognition. The medallion felt weighty in Emily's palm, its significance extending beyond the physical object to encompass the legacy it represented. This wasn't a public honor or official recognition, but something more intimate: acknowledgement from someone who understood precisely what the Thornton family had maintained and why it mattered. "Please thank the General for me," she said, carefully returning the medallion to its box. "And let him know that the honor belongs as much to my grandfather and father as it does to me." I simply continued what they began. After Eliza's departure, Emily found herself drawn once again to the eastern meadow. The survey flags fluttered in the afternoon breeze, marking the boundaries of what would soon be officially protected ground. In the distance, she could see Jake walking the creek line, measuring distances for his watershed protection project, his movements purposeful and engaged. Robert joined her at the property boundary, his wheelchair navigating the packed dirt path that separated the two farms, a path that would soon be merely an internal route within a unified operation. "It's strange," he said, gazing across the meadow. For decades, this view represented obligation, a promise that had to be maintained regardless of circumstances. Now it feels more like opportunity, a legacy that creates possibilities rather than just responsibilities. Emily nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The protection of the eastern meadow had always been framed as a burden to be carried, a solemn duty passed from father to son and eventually to daughter. With the conservation easement in place and the foundation support secured, that same protection now served as the cornerstone for a revitalized farming operation, one that might sustain the Thornton family for generations to come. "I've been thinking about what you said last week," Emily told her father, "about how Grandpa found healing in working the land after the war. I think there's something similar happening here. The promise you and Grandpa kept is now helping heal the farm itself, giving it new purpose and stability after years of struggle." Robert smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that momentarily erased the strain of his stroke recovery. Dad would have appreciated that symmetry. He always believed that right actions created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate purpose. As the sun began its westward descent, casting long shadows across the meadow, Emily found herself contemplating the interconnected nature of the promises that had shaped her family's relationship with this land. What had begun as a soldier's pledge to honor fallen comrades had evolved into a multi-generational commitment that ultimately secured not just the sanctity of the burial site, but the viability of the farm itself. The eastern meadow would remain undisturbed, a quiet memorial to men who had sacrificed for their country. The surrounding land would evolve through thoughtful stewardship, its productivity enhanced rather than compromised by conservation practices. And Thornton Farm, which had teetered on the edge of financial collapse just weeks earlier, now faced a future defined by possibility rather than mere survival. None of this would have happened if she hadn't taken that impossible stand at the Kanma auction, if she hadn't been willing to risk everything to honor a promise she had inherited rather than made herself. There was a lesson in that, Emily reflected, about the value of commitments that transcend practical calculation, about the unexpected ways that honoring the past could sometimes open doors to the future. As she and her father turned back toward the farmhouse, Emily noticed a single monarch butterfly drifting lazily across the meadow, its orange wings vivid against the golden grasses. Next spring, as part of Jake's conservation plan, they would plant milkweed along the buffer strips bordering the creek, creating habitat for these declining insects, while simultaneously protecting water quality for agricultural use. This integration of conservation and production, of honoring the past while innovating for the future, increasingly seemed to define the path forward for Thornton Farm. The promises kept by previous generations had preserved something precious. Her task now was to build upon that foundation, creating new commitments that would secure the land's health and productivity for those who would come after. In the distance, she could see the farmhouse that her grandfather had built after returning from war, expanded and adapted over the years, but still recognizably, the home of a man who had understood the value of sturdy foundations. Beside it, the old barn was being repaired with lumber from trees harvested sustainably from the Whitaker woodlot, the renovation creating storage space for equipment that would serve both properties. The landscape before her represented neither unchanging preservation nor unrestrained development, but something more balanced, a place where human needs and natural systems coexisted through thoughtful stewardship, where history was honored not by freezing the past but by allowing it to inform the future. This, Emily realized, was the true legacy of the promises her family had kept, not just the protection of a specific meadow or the honor paid to fallen soldiers, but the cultivation of a relationship with the land based on obligation rather than mere opportunity, on stewardship rather than simple ownership. As they reached the farmhouse, Sarah met them with news that Jake's grandmother had called. The County Conservation Board had reviewed his watershed protection design and was interested in featuring it as a model project, potentially providing additional funding for implementation. "He's still down by the creek," Emily told Sarah, "taking measurements for the buffer zones. Would you let him know when he comes back? He'll be thrilled." This small victory, a young person's vision recognized and supported by the broader community, felt symbolic of the transformation occurring at Thornton Farm. What had begun as a desperate attempt to prevent development had evolved into something more creative and forward-looking, a collaborative effort to enhance the land's health and productivity while honoring its history. As evening approached, Emily helped her father settle in his favorite chair on the porch, positioning his wheelchair so he could watch the sunset paint the eastern meadow in shades of amber and gold. The survey flags were barely visible now, small white flutters against the darkening landscape, but their presence represented something profoundly reassuring, the translation of personal promises into institutional protections that would outlast individual lifetimes. "We did it, Dad," Emily said quietly. "We kept the promise." Robert nodded, his expression peaceful as he gazed toward the place where soldiers rested beneath native grasses, where commitments made decades ago had been honored through years of quiet vigilance, and where future generations would continue to find meaning in the intersection of human history and natural landscape. "We did more than keep it," he replied. "We gave it a future." As darkness settled over Thornton Farm, Emily recognized the truth in her father's words. The promise to protect the eastern meadow had been fulfilled, but in the process, something new had been created, a vision for agricultural stewardship that honored the past while embracing innovation, that balanced production with protection, that recognized the deep connections between human communities and the landscapes they inhabited. This expanded understanding of obligation and opportunity would guide Thornton Farm forward, informing decisions about land use, conservation practices, and community engagement for generations to come. The meadow would remain untouched, a sacred trust maintained through changing times, but its protection would now serve as inspiration rather than burden, a reminder that some commitments create value precisely because they transcend practical calculation. In the quiet evening air, with crickets beginning their nightly chorus and stars appearing in the darkening sky, Emily felt a profound sense of continuity, of being part of something larger than herself, a chain of commitment stretching backward to her grandfathers, promise and forward to stewards not yet born, who would someday tend this same land with their own understanding of obligation and care. The eastern meadow had been saved, not just for those who rested there, but for all who would come after, a testament to the enduring power of promises kept across generations. 6 months after the auction, the eastern meadow lay blanketed in the first snowfall of winter, its rolling contours softened by 6 inches of pristine white that glittered in the morning sunlight. Emily stood at the edge of the conservation easement, her breath forming clouds in the crisp December air as she surveyed the transformed landscape. The boundary markers had been replaced with more permanent designations, small stone cairns placed at surveyed intervals, unobtrusive but sufficient to delineate the protected area from the working farmland that surrounded it. These subtle markers represented the culmination of months of legal documentation, the formal establishment of protections that would outlast any individual caretaker. Behind her, the sounds of construction carried from the old Whitaker farmhouse, where contractors were completing renovations that would transform the structure into the Thornton Farm Agricultural Education Center. The building that had once housed a solitary veteran would soon welcome students, farmers, and researchers interested in sustainable agriculture and conservation practices. The transformation of Thornton Farm over the past 6 months had been remarkable. With the foundation support and the expanded bank financing, Emily had implemented the integrated management plan for both properties, beginning with infrastructure improvements that would enable more efficient and sustainable operations. The watershed protection system Jake had designed was now partially installed, with vegetated buffer strips already taking root along the creek before winter dormancy set in. Movement at the farm's main entrance caught Emily's attention. A small convoy of vehicles making their way up the long driveway, right on schedule. Today marked the official dedication of the conservation easement, a private ceremony for those most closely connected to the protection effort. General Richards had insisted on attending despite the winter weather, his foundation sending a specially equipped vehicle to transport him safely from the city. Emily made her way back toward the farmhouse, where Sarah had been preparing refreshments since dawn. Robert was already positioned in the renovated parlor, dressed in his best sweater and looking more robust than he had in months. His recovery continued to progress slowly but steadily, his speech growing clearer and his mobility improving with each passing week. "They're arriving," Emily told him, adjusting his blanket against the winter chill that seeped through even the most well-insulated farmhouses. The general's car just turned onto the driveway. Robert nodded, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Everything ready?" "As ready as it can be," Emily replied, glancing around the parlor where historic photographs of both properties now hung alongside maps detailing the conservation easement and the integrated management plan. The room had been transformed into a space that honored the past while clearly looking toward the future, much like the farm itself. Jake appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically formal in a pressed shirt and tie. At his side stood his grandmother, Carmen, equally dressed for the occasion in a deep blue dress that complemented her silver hair. "The historical display is set up in the dining room," Carmen reported. Documents from both families, photographs spanning 3 generations, and the original letters that started this whole journey. Emily had been initially hesitant about creating such an exhibit, concerned that it might feel like exploiting private history for public consumption. But Carmen had persuaded her that documenting the intertwined stories of the Thornton and Whitaker families served an important purpose, establishing the context that made the conservation effort meaningful beyond mere land preservation. "Only for today," Carmen had reminded her. "Just for those who understand what this place means. After the ceremony, we'll archive everything properly for the day when a more public history might be appropriate." The sound of vehicles parking drew them to the front windows. General Richards emerged from the lead car, impressively spry for a man in his 90s, though he leaned heavily on a cane similar to the one he had used at the auction. Behind him came Dr. Montgomery from the foundation, carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained the final easement documentation. The third vehicle yielded a surprise, a woman in her 60s whom Emily didn't recognize, elegant in a camel-colored coat with military bearing evident in her posture and movements. She surveyed the farmhouse with evident interest before following the others toward the front entrance. "Who's that with the general?" Emily asked, turning to her father. Robert's expression registered shock followed by dawning comprehension. "If I'm not mistaken," he said slowly, "that's Colonel Whitaker's daughter." "His daughter? But you said he had no family, that the property went into probate Because there were no heirs. No legal heirs, Robert clarified. James had a daughter from a brief marriage in the 1950s, but they were estranged for decades. Dad mentioned meeting her once in the 1970s when she visited briefly, but she never returned to Willow Creek, as far as I know. Before Emily could process this unexpected development, Sarah was opening the front door to welcome their guests. General Richards entered first, extending his hand to Robert, and then to Emily with the formal courtesy of a man raised in an era when such gestures carried significant meaning. "Mr. Thornton, Miss Thornton," he said warmly. "Thank you for hosting us on this important day." Emily returned his greeting, then turned her attention to the unknown woman who now stood in her parlor, studying the photographs on the wall with particular focus on those featuring James Whittaker. "Miss Thornton," General Richards said, following her gaze, "may I introduce Colonel Elizabeth Whittaker, United States Army, retired. James Whittaker's daughter." Colonel Whittaker stepped forward, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her eyes direct and assessing in a way that reminded Emily of her father's descriptions of James Whittaker. "Miss Thornton," she said, her voice carrying the crispness of someone accustomed to command. "I've been looking forward to meeting you since General Richards informed me of your remarkable actions at the auction." Emily found herself momentarily speechless, struggling to reconcile this poised military officer with the narrative of estrangement her father had mentioned. "I thank you for coming, Colonel. This is unexpected. We were under the impression that your father had no living family." "An understandable conclusion," Colonel Whittaker acknowledged with a small smile that softened her formal demeanor. "My father and I reconciled only in the final year of his life, after decades of separation. By then, his affairs were already arranged to leave the property in probate, and he chose not to alter those plans." She glanced around the parlor, her expression revealing complex emotions beneath her composed exterior. "He said the land had a purpose that transcended family inheritance, that it was already promised to a cause more significant than personal legacy." I didn't fully understand his meaning until General Richards explained the history of this place after the auction. The group moved into the dining room where Carmen had arranged the historical display. Colonel Whittaker paused before the collection of letters and photographs, studying them with evident interest. "I never knew this part of my father's story," she said quietly. "He spoke very little about his wartime experiences, even after our reconciliation. To learn that he shared such a profound connection with your family through all these years." Robert, who had wheeled himself into position beside her, nodded in understanding. "Our fathers were men of their generation, more comfortable with action than explanation. The meadow was something they maintained together for decades without much discussion. The meaning was in the doing, not the telling." Colonel Whittaker turned to him with newfound respect. "You understand exactly. My father was the same way, expressing his values through commitments rather than conversations. It's why our estrangement lasted so long. Neither of us had the vocabulary to bridge the distance between us." As Sarah served coffee and the homemade pastries that had been a Thornton farm tradition for generations, the conversation flowed more easily. Colonel Whittaker explained that she had followed her father into military service despite their differences, serving with distinction in operations from Desert Storm to Afghanistan before retiring to teach at West Point. "I always thought I joined the military to forge my own path, separate from his influence," she reflected. "Only in later years did I recognize how deeply his example had shaped my understanding of duty and service, even during our decades of separation." Dr. Montgomery used a natural pause in the conversation to transition to the official purpose of the gathering. From her leather portfolio, she produced the final easement documentation, bound in a blue cover embossed with the foundation's seal. "With your permission," she said, addressing Emily and Robert, "I'd like to proceed with the formal dedication of the conservation easement." Emily nodded, suddenly emotional at the culmination of efforts that had spanned months of paperwork and years of family commitment. The formal dedication was largely symbolic. The legal protections were already in place, but symbols mattered in honoring obligations that connected generations. Dr. Montgomery opened the document to a page marked for ceremonial signing. This final acknowledgement establishes the permanent protection of the Eastern Meadow as the Lieutenant Michael Fairchild and Colonel James Whitaker Memorial Conservation Easement. Once recorded with the County Register of Deeds, these protections become binding on all future owners in perpetuity. She passed the pen first to Robert, acknowledging his decades of stewardship, then to Emily as the current property owner, and finally to General Richards as the Foundation's representative. Each signature represented a different aspect of the commitment: past vigilance, present action, and future support. When Colonel Whitaker stepped forward to request inclusion in the signing ceremony, no one objected. Though she had no legal standing in the transaction, her presence completed a circle that had begun with 2 soldiers in war-torn Europe and now extended to their descendants, gathered in peaceful commemoration. After the formalities concluded, Emily suggested they visit the meadow itself, weather permitting. The snow had stopped, and the winter sun created a crystalline clarity to the landscape that seemed fitting for the occasion. "I've arranged transportation for those who prefer not to walk," she said, mindful of the advanced age of several participants. "The path to the Eastern Meadow has been cleared, and we've prepared a small marker that we thought appropriate for today's dedication." The group made their way to the meadow with Robert and General Richards traveling in a specially equipped utility vehicle that could navigate the snow-covered farm roads. Colonel Whitaker chose to walk alongside Emily, their conversation turning to the agricultural operations visible across the wider property. "General Richards mentioned your innovative approach to integrating conservation with productive farming," the colonel said. "I'm impressed by the scope of what you've accomplished in such a short time." "Much of the credit belongs to Jake," Emily replied, nodding toward the young man who walked ahead with his grandmother. His environmental science background brought perspectives that traditional farming sometimes overlooks. The Foundation's support made implementation possible, but the vision is increasingly collaborative. At the edge of the meadow, Jake had positioned a simple stone bench facing eastward across the protected landscape. Carved into its surface was a single line, for promises kept across generations. No names, no dates, no explicit reference to those who rested beneath the winter-blanketed ground, just an acknowledgement of the commitments that had preserved this place through decades of change. The inscription matched the medallion General Richards had sent months earlier, creating a subtle connection between private recognition and public commemoration. As the group gathered around this understated memorial, the General spoke briefly about the Foundation's mission to preserve sites with significance to veterans' history, emphasizing that the Eastern Meadow represented an ideal intersection of military heritage, agricultural tradition, and environmental conservation. Colonel Whitaker then surprised everyone by producing a small velvet bag from her coat pocket. "With your permission," she said, addressing Emily directly, "I'd like to add something to this commemoration." From the bag, she withdrew 2 tarnished metal objects, dog tags from World War II, their stamped information still legible despite decades of age. "These belong to my father," she explained, "found among his personal effects after his death. I believe he would want them to remain here, with the men he considered his true brothers in arms." Emily nodded, deeply moved by this unexpected contribution to the memorial. Jake stepped forward with a small trowel, creating a shallow space beneath the stone bench where the dog tags could be secured, protected from the elements but symbolically returned to the landscape their owner had cherished. As Colonel Whitaker placed her father's identification tags in this improvised repository, Emily found herself reflecting on the nature of legacy, how it flowed not just through bloodlines but through commitments honored and promises kept. Through land stewarded and memories preserved, the Eastern Meadow would remain undisturbed, protected. now by legal mechanisms that formalized what had once been maintained through personal vigilance alone. The surrounding farmland would continue evolving through sustainable practices that honored both agricultural productivity and environmental health. And the story that connected these landscapes of soldiers who served, of families who remembered, of communities that valued things beyond monetary measure, would endure through documentation and commemoration designed to survive changing times. As the group stood in respectful silence, snow began falling again, gentle flakes drifting down to blanket the meadow in another layer of pristine white. The natural world continued its cycles regardless of human ceremony, a reminder that true stewardship meant working with rather than against the fundamental rhythms of the land. This understanding that human commitments existed within rather than separate from natural systems increasingly informed Emily's approach to managing both the protected easement and the productive farmland surrounding it. The eastern meadow would remain forever wild, but its preservation would serve as inspiration for practices that enhanced rather than exploited the wider landscape. As the ceremony concluded, Emily watched the small group make their way back toward the farmhouse, their footprints marking a temporary path across the snow-covered fields that would vanish with the next storm. Colonel Whitaker walked beside General Richards, their military bearing evident even in their advanced years, while Jake escorted Carmen and Robert followed in the utility vehicle. Standing alone for a moment at the edge of the eastern meadow, Emily felt a profound sense of completion. The promise that had shaped 3 generations of her family had been fulfilled, transformed from personal obligation to permanent protection. Yet this ending was also a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the ongoing implementation of the watershed project, the launch of the education center, the seasonal demands of a working farm that now encompassed both properties. The eastern meadow was secure, but the work of stewardship continued, evolving to meet changing circumstances while honoring unchanging commitments. As Emily turned to follow the others, she noticed a lone bald eagle circling high above the meadow, its powerful wings spread against the winter sky. Whether coincidence or something more meaningful, the sight of this symbol of American sacrifice seemed a fitting conclusion to a day honoring men who had served their country in the most profound ways. Some stories don't end so much as transform, becoming foundations for new narratives that build upon rather than replace what came before. The story of Emily Thornton and the Eastern Meadow wasn't just about preserving a burial site or outbidding developers. It was about recognizing that some values transcend generations, that some promises create ripples, extending far beyond their original purpose. If you've been moved by Emily's journey to honor her family's legacy, please subscribe to our channel. For more stories that celebrate ordinary people taking extraordinary stands for what matters most. Tomorrow, we'll share another remarkable account of courage and commitment that will remind you that the most meaningful victories often come when we fight for something beyond ourselves.